Our spinal cord innervates the peripheral body parts via the spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and each spinal nerve originates from its respective spinal cord segment. It then exits the intervertebral foramen to innervate the peripheral body parts. Therefore, it is important to know the relationship between the spinal nerves, the vertebral bodies, and the intervertebral foraminas. Let's start with this illustration over here. If you look over here, you can see that each cervical spinal nerve exits through the intervertebral foramen above its respective cervical vertebrae. What I mean by that is that, see, the C1, the first cervical spinal nerve, is exiting through the intervertebral foramen above the C1 vertebrae. The C2, the second cervical spinal nerve, is then exiting above the C2 vertebrae through the intervertebral foramen, and so on. However, you should know that there's a mismatch between the number of cervical spinal nerves and cervical vertebrae. There are 8 cervical nerves, but there are only 7 cervical vertebrae. Therefore, the 8th cervical nerve exits through the intervertebral foramen above the first thoracic vertebrae. And so from here onward, what you can see is that each thoracic spinal nerve is exiting below the corresponding thoracic vertebrae. So T1 can be seen, the first thoracic spinal nerve can be seen exiting beneath the T1 vertebrae. The second thoracic spinal nerve, the T2 nerve, is exiting now through the intervertebral foramen below the T2 vertebrae, and so on. What you can also see over here is that, see, the spinal nerves are kind of more horizontal as they exit through the intervertebral foramina superiorly. However, the length of the spinal cord kind of falls short of the length of the vertebral column, and therefore as we descend down the vertebral column, the nerves must travel a longer distance over here, kind of more obliquely, prior to exiting through the respective intervertebral foramina. Consequently, there is bunching of the spinal nerves below the cord, mainly comprising of the lumbar and the sacral spinal nerves. These lumbar and sacral spinal nerves still have to descend downward to reach their respective intervertebral foramina in order to exit the vertebral column in the lumbar and the sacral regions. This bunching of the lower lumbar and sacral spinal nerves is called as cauda equina. A damage to the cauda equina, for instance, in case of a disc herniation or because of lumbar spinal stenosis, can result in a clinical condition which is called cauda equina syndrome, in which a patient can present with motor weakness of the lower limbs, for example, sensory loss in the lower limb, fecal urinary incontinence, back pain, and even sexual dysfunction. There's a lot of overlap as far as the presentation of cauda equina syndrome and conus medullaris syndrome is concerned. Remember, the conus medullaris is this lower conical ending of the spinal cord, and the fecal and urinary control centers are present inside the conus medullaris, and the compression of this region could also result in the similar clinical presentation which we discussed in cauda equina syndrome. However, you might not be able to see central nervous system dysfunction in a cauda equina syndrome, whereas in case of a conus medullaris syndrome, the central nervous system dysfunction might be visible. The presentation could be acute or chronic, and the two conditions could be differentiated based on the imaging such as MRI and or a CAT scan. Now that we have learned about the gross anatomical features of the spinal cord, how about if we actually take the help of a prosection of the spinal cord to review some of the gross anatomical features of the spinal cord quickly one more time. Now here what you can see is a prosection of the spinal cord. See, the spinal cord is kind of ending over here in a cone-shaped fashion. This cone-like ending of the spinal cord, this is known as the conus medullaris. You can see that the spinal cord was covered over by 3 meningeal wrappings. Now the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, which were covering over the spinal cord, they have been removed. So the meningeal coverings have been cut in the middle and the flaps have been removed to either side. So what you can see over here is now the spinal cord, which is covered over by the innermost meningeal covering, which is the pia mater. You can see some of the extensions of the pia mater on the lateral side of the spinal cord. These are the denticulate ligaments, and you can see the spinal nerves popping off from the spinal cord. The spinal nerves in the lower region of the spinal cord extend more obliquely, and this bunching of the lower lumbar and the sacrospinal nerves underneath the spinal cord, this is known as the cauda equina. The pia mater, the spinal cord ends at the L1 level in case of an adult in a cone-shaped fashion, which we said was the conus medullaris. However, the pia mater continues to extend down from the L1 level, and this extension of the pia mater down below in a vertical fashion is known as the filum terminale, which we can see over here. The filum terminale in a gross prosection can be differentiated from the lumbar spinal and sacral spinal nerves of the cauda equina by its color. The filum terminale is an extension of pia mater, so that's going to be more or less off-white in coloration, whereas the nerves are going to be more yellowish in coloration. Now let's talk about some of the horizontal and vertical support anchors of the spinal cord. Now, as we discussed before as well, our spinal cord and the brain, which means our central nervous system, is covered over by three meningeal wrappings. From outside to inside, these include the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and then the pia mater, which is the innermost, and that is tightly enveloping the brain and the spinal cord. The space between the dura and the arachnoid mater is called as the subarachnoid space, and that is filled with a fluid which is known as the cerebrospinal fluid, the CSF. Both the brain and the spinal cord are floating inside the subarachnoid space in this fluid, which is the CSF, and so in order to hold the spinal cord in its position in this fluid medium, there exists some horizontal and vertical anchors, which are actually extensions of the pia mater of the spinal cord. Now have a look at this illustration over here. What you can see here is that you're looking at the spinal cord from the back over here. See the dura mater and the arachnoid, they have been cut open, and the flaps of the dura and the arachnoid mater have been flipped over, so we can uncover the spinal cord and see the spinal cord from the back. The spinal cord is still covered over by the pia mater, which is the innermost meningeal wrapping and is in tight approximation with the spinal cord. You can see the lateral extensions of the pia mater over here. These lateral triangular extensions of the pia mater are known as the denticulate ligament. We can see a denticulate ligament here. We can see another one over here. We can see a denticulate ligament here, another one over here. In total, there are 21 pairs of denticulate ligaments which extend all along the length of the spinal cord on the lateral aspect of the spinal cord. Each denticulate ligament can be seen piercing through the arachnoid mater, and then it firmly gets attached to the dura mater, thus serving as the horizontal anchor of the spinal cord. Now this prosection on the right gives us a ventral view of the spinal cord. Once again, we're looking at the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, which has been peeled off from the spinal cord. So once again, we've given a midline incision and removed the flaps of the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, which were initially covering over the spinal cord, and now we can see the spinal cord clearly. We're looking at the ventral aspect of the spinal cord over here, and see the spinal cord is still enveloped by the pia mater. We can see the thick, tough, fibrous dura mater over here, and you can see the relatively more transparent arachnoid mater, which is attached on the inner aspect of the dura mater and kind of peeled off the dura mater a little bit, so you can differentiate between the two layers over here. See, this is the dura mater, this is the arachnoid mater. Pia mater is still enveloping the spinal cord, and you can see the lateral extensions of the pia mater over here. These are the denticulate ligaments. We can see several denticulate ligaments here as well. See, the denticulate ligament is clearly piercing the arachnoid mater, and then it is attached to the dura mater, and thus the 21 pairs of denticulate ligaments all along the length of the spinal cord, they are attached to the dura mater, serving, as we said, as the horizontal anchors of the spinal cord. What you can also appreciate over here is that, see, the denticulate ligaments are covered over by the nerve roots. These are the ventral nerve roots, which are in front of the denticulate ligaments. The denticulate ligaments are sandwiched between the ventral and dorsal nerve roots. So since we're looking at the spinal cord from the ventral aspect, we can see the ventral nerve roots followed by the denticulate ligaments. The posterior or the dorsal nerve roots are going to be behind the denticulate ligaments, so we can't really see them over here. In this illustration over here, we were looking at the spinal cord from the back or from its dorsal side. So here we can see the dorsal nerve roots and then the denticulate ligaments, whereas the ventral nerve roots are not much visible. Now that we know about the denticulate ligaments, how about if we cover the vertical anchor of the spinal cord, which is known as the filum terminale? We all know by now that the spinal cord, in case of an adult, ends at the L1 vertebral level. However, the pia mater still continues to descend down from the tip of the conus medullaris at the L1 level, and this vertical extension of the pia mater is known as filum terminale. As the filum terminale is an extension of the pia mater, so it's slightly off-white in coloration, and the color basically helps us differentiate the filum terminale from the surrounding spinal nerves of the cauda equina, which are more or less yellow in coloration. You can see that very nicely in this illustration on the left over here. See, the spinal cord is ending at the L1 vertebral level, but the pia mater is still extending down, and this extension of the pia mater is known as the filum terminale. You can also probably see in this illustration is that although the spinal cord ends at the L1 vertebral level, but the arachnoid matter and the dura mater, which are enveloping the spinal cord, they still continue down, and the arachnoid matter is going to end at this level over here, at the lower level, at the lower border of the S2 vertebrae. This space over here between the ending of the spinal cord at the L1 level and the ending of the arachnoid membrane at the S2 level, this space over here is a subarachnoid space, and that does not contain any spinal cord. It will contain only some spinal nerves which belong to the cauda equina, and a fluid called the CSF would be residing over here. So this is a safe site to do a lumbar puncture as well. Now what you can see over here is the pia mater is still extending down from the L1 vertebral level, from the lower end of the spinal cord, from the conus medullaris part of the spinal cord. This extension we said was the filum terminale. You can see the filum terminale extends down all the way to the S2 level where the arachnoid membrane is ending, and then it pierces through the arachnoid membrane and continues down all the way to get attached to the body of the coccyx. And hence we can actually divide the filum terminale into two parts. Filum terminale internum, extending from the conus medullaris, from the L1 vertebral level to the S2 vertebral level, which is inside the subarachnoid space, and then the filum terminale externum, which is extending from the S2 vertebral level all the way down to the coccyx. The filum terminale externum is also sometimes known as the coccygeal ligament. Lastly, in context of talking about the anchoring support for the spinal cord, we know that the denticulate ligaments, we said that the denticulate ligaments serve as the horizontal anchors of the spinal cord. However, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves which emerge from the spinal cord segments and exit the intervertebral foraminas. In addition to the denticulate ligaments, which are the main horizontal anchors of the spinal cord, the spinal nerves exiting through the intervertebral foramina also serve to provide some horizontal anchorage to the spinal cord.